Thank you. Next item of business is a debate on motion 19631, the name of Fergus Ewing, on the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to open this debate to mark the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act. In 1919, Scotland looked very different from today. The landscape itself was different. In 1920, the newly formed Forestry Commission calculated that there were just over 460,000 hectares of woodland in Scotland, only 5% of Scotland's land area. Scotland's forests had been a vital resource in the Great War. David Lloyd George remarked that the war was more nearly lost through lack of timber than want of food. But those forests were perilously depleted. Over 200 square miles of woodland had been felled since 1914. That was the backdrop, Presiding Officer, to the 1919 Forestry Act, which created the Forestry Commission with the aims of replanting felled areas, of creating new woodlands, and of better timber production. Scotland's forests were called on again during the Second World War. Robin Jenkins' great Scottish novel, The Cone Gatherers, brings to life the work to collect the seeds needed to restock Scotland's forests at the end of that war. The war years also saw the creation of the Women's Timber Corps, the Lumberjills. In 2007, the then Environment Minister, Mike Russell, joined surviving members to unveil a statue in the Queen Elizabeth Forest Park to commemorate the 4,000 members of that corps. Less well known, perhaps, is the contribution of foresters from across the Commonwealth. I was glad to be in contact last year, and this with the High Commissioner of Belize, to acknowledge the huge contribution made by the 900 men of the British Honduran Forestry Unit during the war. Over 6,000 also came from Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and many of them chose to stay and make their lives here, and some have descendants who I hope are proud of their roots and their heritage, and also now of being Scots. In this year's programme for government, we said we would plant a woodland to commemorate these foresters from across the Commonwealth, and also to mark the centenary of the 1919 Act. Presiding Officer, there can be no more fitting legacy to mark this pivotal contribution from foresters from our fellow Commonwealth states than to plant trees. So I can announce today that through a partnership with Glasgow City Council, there will be a new planting of trees in Pollok Park in Glasgow. I'm particularly pleased this should be the location, given the prominent role, the very prominent role, played by Sir John Stirling Maxwell, who owned the Pollok estate before it was given to the people of Glasgow, in inspiring and running the Forestry Commission in its early years. So I can also announce that this planting will be expanded following consultation and engagement with the local community and stakeholder organisations to create a living memorial to mark 100 years of the Forestry Act that locals and visitors will be able to enjoy for, I hope, the next 100 years. Presiding Officer, 100 years on, we have ensured Scotland's forestry sector looks to the future. Last year, we passed the Forestry and Land Management Scotland Act to ensure forestry is accountable to and the responsibility of Scottish ministers and this Parliament. On 1st April this year, we created two agencies, Scottish Forestry, to advise on forestry policy, to regulate the sector, and to support sustainable forest management. And second, Forestry and Land Scotland, to manage Scotland's publicly owned national forests and land. Earlier this month, I was glad to launch FLS's corporate plan, which is ambitious about the potential of this invaluable natural resource for the country. In February, with cross-party support, we published Scotland's forestry strategy. This describes how, by 2070, Scotland will have yet more forests. They will be sustainably managed and better integrated with other land uses. They will provide a more resilient and adaptable resource with greater natural capital value. And they will support a strong economy, a thriving environment, and healthy and flourishing communities. We will report on progress in delivering the strategy and we will publish an implementation plan, and I look forward to providing further details of that to Parliament next year. Presiding Officer, the strategy makes clear how versatile are Scotland's forests, that they provide a home to over 1,000 species, that they enrich the lives and improve the health of millions of people who live, work and play in them. But the strategy also demonstrates their unique importance in tackling the overarching challenge of climate change. Their contribution is unique because Scotland's forests are a powerful carbon sink which we can expand. Our climate change plan includes ambitious targets to do that, and in 2018-19 we smashed our annual target of 10,000 hectares by planting 11,210 hectares. That was 84% of the woodland created in the UK in that year. But we must go further. The programme for government sets a new aim to create 12,000 hectares of woodland in 2019-20. This is ambitious, especially in the light of reduction of nursery stock, but we have made available extra resources of £5 million. And we anticipate accelerating and increasing our targets beyond 2021. The contribution Scotland's forests make to fighting climate change is unique also in the opportunity it represents. Already, Scotland has a thriving forestry sector, supporting 25,000 jobs and contributing no less than £1,000 million a year to the economy. The industry's leadership group, which I met on Tuesday this week, has published a strategy to double that contribution by 2030. Expanding our forests and the contribution our forestry sector is good for our national economy. It will help support the population of our rural areas, and it will help fight climate change by removing millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and by locking it up indefinitely in the millions of tonnes of timber harvested for long-term uses such as construction. Presiding Officer, 100 years on from 1919, Scotland's forests cover around 19% of our land area, and our publicly owned national forests and land extend to 640,000 hectares. Forestry is, of its nature, a long-term business. It's right to look back on 100 years of achievement, and it's right to appreciate those who have contributed to those achievements. They provide us and our children with a woodland inheritance rich in opportunities for the next 100 years.
Cabinet Secretary, could you move the motion? I don't think you moved.
So moved.
Thank you. I now call Colin Smith to speak to move amendment 19631.4. Mr Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's 100 years since the 1990 Forestry Act was passed and the Forestry Commission was born, overseeing the transformation from a largely unregulated private forestry industry then to the thriving sector we know today. A century ago, just 5% of Scotland's land was forested. Today, forest and woodland covers 19% of Scotland. In my own home region of Dumfries and Galloway, 31% of the land is covered with woods and forests, making it the most forested part of Scotland. These 211,000 hectares range from the great spruce forests of Galloway and Estill through the traditional estate forests, such as those of Buccleuch estates, to the small native and farm woodlands so important to the beautiful landscape of Dumfries and Galloway. Those woods and forests also make a huge economic contribution to the region. The timber industry is one of the most important employers locally, with more than 3,000 jobs across all sectors, from planting to processing, many within some of the most remote rural areas. Indeed, across Scotland, the forestry sector is of huge economic importance, contributing almost £1 billion of GVA to the Scottish economy every year, supporting more than 25,000 jobs. So I want to pay tribute to all those who work in the sector, past and present, who have contributed to its growth and success over the past 100 years. And I want to place on record Labour's thanks to the trade unions who represent many of those workers, Unite, GMB, PCS, Prospect and the FDA, for the work they do securing the best terms and conditions for their workers. Forestry is a high-risk industry. Every year workers are injured at work. In some cases, sadly, they are killed. Many more suffer from work-related illness. So we should recognise the important role our unions have played, in some cases for more than a century, in driving up safety for those workers in forestry as the industry has grown. But it's not just that the forestry coverage of our land and its economic impact that has grown in that time, so too has our recognition or appreciation of the social benefits of forestry. Since the 1970s in particular, the Forestry Commission has encouraged more people to see forests and their land as destinations for leisure and exercise. This shift in focus has helped unlock our land's potential for contributing to improving health and well-being, and today, more than ever, we need to build upon this legacy. An important contributor to delivering the economic, social and environmental benefits of our land have been our national parks. 19 years ago, this Parliament introduced the National Parks Scotland Act 2000. It paved the way for the Labour-led Scottish Executive to create the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park in 2002 and the Cairngorms National Park in 2003. A report by the Scottish Campaign for National Parks has identified 7 possible new national parks in Scotland, including the Galloway National Park, centred around the outstanding Galloway Forest Park, which would allow us to build on the outstanding natural assets of the region. Where we have seen national parks, it's helped deliver a major economic boost to those areas, supporting local businesses, generating jobs for young people, providing affordable homes, promoting investment in sustainable rural development and growing the tourism sector. And they have delivered an environmental boost, restoring paths and peatlands, assisting with species recovery and, crucially, restoring and conserving native woodlands. That work is so important because one of the downsides of the changes we have seen in forestry over the past 100 years has been the extent to which our native woodlands were left to decline either through neglect or in some cases by design. The economic value of native woodland fell as their uses were replaced by imports, and only niche markets which used native timber were left. Across Scotland, huge swathes of our countryside were planted with conifers, which became standard forestry policy in the drive to increase timber production, incentivised by huge tax breaks. Today, we are slowly learning from these past mistakes. Native woods are better protected, are no longer persecuted, and there are landscape-scale restoration efforts such as the Great Trossachs Forest National Nature Reserve at the heart of the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park. But as diversity continues to decline globally, far more needs to be done to appreciate that our native woodlands are some of the most biodiverse habitats. We must better safeguard and expand those habitats from the measly 2% they cover today. Excuse me. Forestry has a crucial role to play in helping Scotland tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis we face, including meeting our new emissions targets, with estimates suggesting that every new hectare of forest and woodland created removes an average of 7 tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere every year. This must be a key driver in Scottish forestry policy in the years ahead, including continuing to expand planting, but crucially in the right places and with the right and proper mix of species. In concluding, Presiding Officer, we have seen impressive growth in the forestry sector since the Forestry Commission was established 100 years ago. But as this growth continues, it's critical that it is managed well and we properly balance the economic, social and environmental benefits of a sector that is so important to many of our communities across Scotland. Can I therefore formally move Labour's amendment in my name? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Smith. And I call Peter Chapman. Mr Chapman, please.
I thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am delighted to open on behalf of the Conservatives today, and I welcome the opportunity to speak about the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act. Before the establishment of the Forestry Act, there was no notable state policy on forests. It had been recognised that the UK's forests had been in decline since the Middle Ages, but World War I led to an increased demand for timber, and by the end of the conflict, forest cover had significantly declined. Moreover, there was an acute awareness of the strategic risks of an over-reliance on imported timber. It was noted at the time that only 5% of Great Britain was wooded, compared to 25% in Germany. This led to great concern regarding the state of British forests and woodland. The Act was passed to alleviate these concerns and establish the Forestry Commission. The Act gave authority to the Commission to acquire and plant land, promote timber supply and forest industries, undertake education and research, make grants and give advice to woodland owners. The Forestry Commission went from strength to strength, and by the start of World War II, it was the largest landowner in Britain. And during the war period, employment in the Forestry Commission expanded to 44,000 in 1941, up from 14,000 in 1939. And many of these new employees included the Women's Timber Corps, who were affectionately known as the lumberjills. Another group that must be acknowledged and thanked for their contribution to the British war effort is the British Honduran Forestry Unit. And these volunteers arrived in a harsh Scottish winter and swapped tropical forests for hard frosts, which must have been a huge shock to the system. The end of the war saw the Commission turn more of its attention to research, especially into how to increase production. And by the 1960s, the Forestry Commission was carrying out 40% of all tree planting in the UK and had greatly increased timber sales, leading to the creation of thousands of new jobs. However, in an era when there was an increase in the amount of available leisure time, the forests were beginning to be seen as a place of recuperation and relaxation. This led to the creation of the Countryside Act in 1968 and granted the right to roam, allowing the public greater use of the forest for recreational purposes. This led to a trend of sustainable forestry, which has continued until today. Indeed, from 1997, all conifer or productive woodland has been planted under the UK Forestry Standard, to include at least 25% of the area managed primarily for biodiversity objectives and comprising native broadleaves and open areas. Scotland's forests and woodlands are important in promoting tourism through providing stunning natural beauty, and the importance of this in supporting the rural economy is estimated to be worth £183 million in 2015. The recent creation of two new agencies to help manage Scotland's forests, Forestry and Land Scotland and Scottish Forestry, marked the fact that forestry had become fully devolved. Today, forest and woodlands cover 19% of our land. However, while this is a significant improvement, it still falls well short of the EU average of 38%. Moreover, the Scottish Government should acknowledge that from 2002 until 2018, they did not meet the target of planting 10,000 hectares, and this will lead to a scarcity of trees in 30 years' time. I welcome the fact that we have achieved our planting target this year, and I also welcome the increased planting targets going forward. Presiding Officer, the important environmental role of sustainably managed forest and woodland cannot be overstated in the battle against climate change. Growing trees absorb and store huge amounts of carbon. In addition to this, almost 50% of the carbon benefit of a forest comes from the substitution of wood fuel and timber for fossil fuels. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Scotland is better for the Forestry Act of 1919, and we encourage people to celebrate this by getting involved in planting more trees over the next 100 years. However, this must be done only where it is economically and environmentally sustainable. We must not repeat the mistakes of the past and plant trees on deep peat, as we did so disastrously on the Flow Country a generation ago. Nor will we plant our best arable land, which is needed to feed our population. However, I believe there is still plenty of land in Scotland which can usefully and profitably grow trees, and that is what we should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Chapman. I now call John Finney. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And I'm delighted to be speaking in this debate 100 years on from the Forestry Act and the beginning of a major effort to reforest the United Kingdom. Also, that was the legislation that led to the creation of the Forestry Commission and a major programme of planting and building a nationally owned forest estate. Now, as has been said, at the time of the legislation, only 5% of the UK was forested. And 100 years later, and 18% of Scotland is forested. Now, to put that into context, grouse shooting estates alone make up 20% of all land in Scotland. So that puts it very clearly into context. And it's still a long way from what the Scottish Green Party would like to see, and that's a target of 40%, the average across across Europe, and that was part of an amendment which wasn't selected for this debate. And with the climate emergency, meeting this target is more urgent than ever. And as things stand at the moment, it's unfortunate that current reforestation rates, it will be 150 years before we meet this target. But it's important to be positive, and there is a lot to be positive about. We need to learn from and be inspired by the vision and impetus shown 100 years ago and commit to a major reforestation programme. That will assist in tackling the climate emergency and create rural jobs and economic opportunity throughout Scotland. Now, research for the Revive Coalition shows that forestry can provide a job for every 42 hectares. Now, that compares with agriculture, which provides a job for every 183 hectares, and grouse shooting, which provides one job for 330 hectares. So again, the benefits should be clear for everyone to see. Now, I'm proud to say I was born and brought up in a forest house. My father was a labourer with the Forestry Commission for 25 years. In fact, he operated a Forestry Commission horse. There's not too many of them about now. And I also went on to work for the Forestry Commission, and the big attraction, of course, as with a lot of the public sector, was the housing they provided. And it created a lot of communities, particularly across the Highlands. And that was the case with, for instance, the hydro, where I was, and also the canal. I was a tree feller. I was a member. It was one of the duties I did, cutting down trees, and a squad of about a dozen people. That's been overtaken by one machine. But of course, the challenge we know now is that the skills shortage means that we have difficulty recruiting for these machines. These are very expensive machines. So we're calling for a Green New Deal to mobilise the unprecedented public investment behind reforestation and supporting the development of sustainable forests and related businesses. Because as the Cabinet Secretary and others have alluded to, there's a lot of ancillary business runs in line with forestry. And we need to particularly focus on building the forest estate. There's been significant acquisition and disposals over the years, and indeed public loan forests are important to be managed for current and future generations. And we also need to alter the profile of who owns the estate. Much of the land is in the hands of a small number of privileged individuals, and it's dominated by blood sport interests, particularly in the uplands. That's leading to limited rural employment opportunities, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, serious erosion of the public enjoyment of our land, and the many benefits that that brings. And that's in stark contrast to what native forest restoration and creation could play in creating new opportunities and fighting climate breakdown. Now, the sum of £1 billion has been mentioned, and that's the money that does support the rural population. And certainly, I don't suppose I'm alone in wanting to see the products being used. So rather than importing cheap PVC window frames and door frames from the Far East, it would be very good if we could harness greater use of our own timber. As I say, greater diversity of ownership is important too. So in the short time I've left, I would like to mention a first-year student at the School of Forestry, which is at Balloch in the outskirts of Inverness. And this is a first-year student, Lawrence Carlyle, who said, and I quote here, "In terms of the climate emergency that we now face, I believe that drastic carbon emission cuttings and sequestration through nature-based, drawn-down strategies like afforestation and peatland restoration is of the utmost importance, and that by reforesting the landscape in an ecological sensitive way, we can also go some way to help mitigate the effects of climate change, such as droughts and flooding." So as we celebrate 100 years, I suggest that we redouble these efforts and particularly pay attention to Lawrence's words. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr Finney. I now call on Mike Rumbles. Mr Rumbles, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is indeed a splendid opportunity to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Forestry Act. And right at the onset of this debate, can I make it clear that the Scottish Liberal Democrats wholeheartedly support the motion before us this afternoon. Now, we've already heard that 100 years ago, the forestry cover of the UK was estimated to have fallen to only about 5% of its land surface. But throughout our history, over thousands of years, people have most commonly created farmland at the expense of forestry. So any potential tension between farming and forestry is not exactly a modern phenomenon. However, after the tragedy of the First World War, our forestry cover was estimated to be at an all-time low. Essentially, the 1919 Act setting up the Forestry Commission was principally designed to ensure that Britain maintained a strategic reserve of timber from a very low base indeed. Even today, it's estimated, as the motion highlights, that Scotland has only about 19% of its land surface under timber. Even at this level of coverage, it remains one of the most deforested countries in Europe. This level of woodland cover is well below the current European average of almost double that at 37%. So we've got a long way to go. Indeed, looking at the figures provided by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, the total area of National Forest estate and woodland has been in steady decline for some considerable time. However, in 2010, there was a marked jump in forestation, but the level has then declined. And I quote from page 10 of the SPICE document. Quote, planting rates averaged 8,000 hectares per annum between 2012 and 2015. In 2016, the rate fell to just 4,600 hectares per annum. The Scottish Government has a target of averaging 10,000 hectares per annum of new woodland creation from 2015 onwards, which is yet to be met, unquote. Now, I very much welcome the Scottish Government's target for new planting of 10,000 hectares per annum. The problem has been in reaching it. I very much hope that the Scottish Government is successful in its forestry ambitions. It's absolutely right that our new planting is increased, not only because it's important to have a strong timber industry, which is a major contribution to the economy, but even more importantly, it is a major increase in tree planting, which is essential for the country to meet its climate change objectives, tackling what is perhaps the most important issue of our time. So I wish the Scottish Government well here. I encourage them to meet their new tree planting targets, and I know the Cabinet Secretary is sincere in aiming to do just that. Turning to Labour's amendment, we support the establishment of new national parks, learning from the Cairngorms and the Loch Lomond experiences. They were created at the time of the Liberal Democrat-Labour coalition, almost 20 years ago, which I remember so well with fond memory. But one of those lessons was that we must take a grassroots approach to establishing national parks, and we should not take a top-down approach. It is for communities themselves to decide if they want the benefits of improvements in land management, conservation and tourism which national parks provide. However, these should not be imposed on communities, as I think the Labour amendment almost threatens. So with that caveat, oh, I see the Labour Party, but you're telling the government to establish new national parks. It really should be a bottom-up approach, not a top-down one. So with that caveat, we will vote for Labour's amendment this afternoon, and we fully support the government motions too.
Colin Smith.
Member, take an intervention. Can you tell us whereabouts in either my statement or Labour's motion we plan to impose any national parks, given that the one referred to in Galloway is actually very much a bottom-up approach? Is Mike Rumbles telling the people of Galloway he opposes that? Because I think he needs to say no, particularly to his election candidates in the weeks ahead.
Mr Rumbles.
I had actually finished, Presiding Officer.
You finished. You don't want to retort back. You've got time if you like. Maybe stop while you quit while you're ahead if you think you're ahead. Now, excuse me, you speak through the chair, Mr Smith, and you don't use the term you. I thought we were all getting on nicely. I thought we all loved trees. Let's go back to the tone of the debate prior to this little altercation, which was unnecessary. I call Stuart Stevenson, followed by Finlay Carson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And perhaps I'll simply start and close off the issue of national parks and saying it's slightly unusual to incorporate it in an amendment in the way it's done. None of that is to be opposed to national parks. I think it's slightly odd. But there we are. That's kind of neither here nor there. The 1919 debate on the second reading of the Forestry Bill, which took place on the 5th of August and went on until 8 o'clock in the evening, gave slightly different figures. It said there was only 4% of the UK covered by forestry, not 5%. I don't think we should argue about percent here or there. But more fundamentally, it illustrated the problem in that it said that in 1915-16, 3/4 of the amount of timber that the UK required had to be imported. That was the scale of the problem. And that's at a point when Germany had many, many times more acres planted. John Finney may be interested to know that in that debate also it was identified there were 5 million acres of sporting land that were thought to be suitable for planting and that it would be a better use of that land. So some debates are not new. They were part of the original second reading debate in the House of Commons in 1919. Like others, I am very pleased to mark the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act. One of my ministerial responsibilities before I demitted office some time ago was forestry, and I very much enjoyed that part of my portfolio, because forests are important, and forestry supports so many jobs downstream, not simply in the direct line. We build timber frame houses, we have sawmills, and they all make an important contribution to our economy and to climate change. The first Forestry Act, of course, was because of the war emergency. It was vital that we had timber then, and it was recognised we needed to do something about it. We know too that forestry can help or hinder, depending how it's implemented, the dangers related to climate change. Trees can absorb water and promote higher soil infiltration rates, and that helps us in relation to flooding. They capture carbon out there, they store it. They're huge and important carbon sinks. So we celebrate our forests not simply for their physical expression of what we might otherwise express in poetry. They are a visual poetry, a feast for the mind as well as for the nose and for the environment. They are crucial for our future. And we've become more aware of the importance of them. The Community Woodlands Association, although not set up until 2003, was something that came from an appreciation of the importance of community woodlands for decades before that. So yes, in terms of Mike Rumble's contribution that relates to national parks, I think communities too, through the Community Asset Transfer Scheme that we passed in 2017, are taking more interest in forestry than they used to. And many people who sit at screens each day, who are parked in offices, forests are contributing to their mental health. There's quietness, there's stillness, there's a placid environment that is a balm for the soul. It's important too, of course, that we think of where we go now. We've got a lot of more to do to plant forests in Scotland. I hope that we continue to do it. In 1919, my father was 14 years old and at Fortrose Academy, and my father's cousin James Stevenson was part of Lloyd George's government, who brought forward this bill in 1919. Presiding officer.
Thank you very much. I call Finlay Carson to be followed by Bruce Crawford. Mr. Carson, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be celebrating our forest industry today, especially when it's of such importance to my constituency in Galloway and West Dumfries, as the Deputy Presiding Officer is well aware. The forestry industry has changed beyond all recognition since the Act was passed a century ago, and it will continue to evolve in future generations to meet our new challenges. Galloway is home to the largest forest park in the United Kingdom. Created in 1947, it extends to almost 300 square miles and 97,000 hectares. It also has the honour of being designated the UK's first dark sky park a decade ago, helping to bring thousands of tourists to the region each year as one of the best stargazing spots in Europe. The forest and the people who live in it and work there were featured in the hugely popular TV series recently, The Forest. It's also home to two of the world-famous Seven-Stane mountain bike trails at Coroctory and Glentrool, with stunning scenery and routes for all ages and abilities. At Coroctory, a 10-minute cycle ride from my home, we have everything from family trails to single tracks for the more experienced mountain bikers, as well as extensive walking routes. At Glentrool, you can try your hand at everything from fun routes to a long road-based forest ride. In addition, at other forestry sites across Dumfries and Galloway, we have the bike trails at A Forest, maybe near Dumfries and in Dalbeattie. But the fun doesn't just stop in the forest with just mountain biking. You can relax at the Coroctory Visitor Centre or head to the wild hide to watch red squirrels and birds, which are right now under the most fantastic colours of the autumn tree canopy, or enjoy a walk round Bruntus Loch, and not to mention the fabulous Red Deer Range, a wild goat park. The area truly is an international gem in terms of the natural environment and biodiversity. And I often wonder if the foresters at the heart of creating the Galloway Forest Park just after the Second War could have imagined how it would look today. Whilst there has been a boom of activity within the park in recent years, with many new projects boosting tourist numbers, I would argue that the Galloway region as a whole has not seen the employment benefits it should have done.
Still, far too few jobs are being created despite greater facilities being made available for visitors and local people. And that's why we in these benches are pleased to support the Labour amendment, which in effect calls for the designation of new national parks. And there can be no better place to start than in Galloway. National park status for Galloway would bring transformational change to the region and help support truly sustainable growth, sustainable in terms of the economy and the environment. The Galloway National Park Association have a very active bottom-up campaign in Galloway with wide support for it. And despite evidencing the support and the huge benefits it would bring to the region, this government appears to keep raising the bar on what they are asking the association to do to formally start the process to look at establishing the park. So I call on the Cabinet Secretary and his ministers to set out clearly the process which if followed, which would trigger the required consultation feasibility studies outlined in the legislation for creating new national parks. Our forestry sector, environment and rural economy would undoubtedly benefit from that status, and given the right governance, they can be the catalyst for us to truly maximise the benefits we can derive from the forest. I hope that today's debate reinforces how important this industry is to many of our communities and that we must continue to support those who work there. I call on the Government again to look at new ways in which they can help the Galloway Forest Park grow and flourish. I regularly say that I'm privileged to be the constituency MSP for Scotland's most beautiful constituency, and that's in no small part down to the fact that it has the Galloway Forest Park. And I applaud all those that work in it to make it such a success.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I call Bruce Crawford to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak in this debate on the centenary of the Forestry Act. No one can have any doubt that forestry and woodland areas play a huge role in Scotland's economic and social life. And crucially, they also form part of our natural and historical heritage, are vital habitats for diverse ecosystems, and they will no doubt be part of the solution to tackling climate change. And that will certainly be the case for significant parts of the rural areas in my Stirling constituency. Of course, the Stirling area is home to the Queen Elizabeth Forest Park, a stunning area with an amazing range of wooded areas and visitor attractions. It ranges from Strathire in the north down to the east side of Loch Lomond and takes in Loch Catrin and Aberfoyle areas too. This gives plenty of scope for activities such as walking, wildlife watching and cycling, as well, of course, vitally for logging. Forestry and Land Scotland also promote the Three Lochs Drive, a 7-mile-long forest drive that gives visitors the opportunity to see the stunning Trossachs area for themselves. The Lodge Forest Visitor Centre, located in Aberfoyle, is the first stop for visitors looking to explore the area. It is an example of the importance of our natural heritage for tourism, the visitor numbers it creates, and the overall economy. Much of this area benefits from a strong presence of native woodland. From the latest forestry figures I could find, detailing the impact and importance of native woodlands cover 6% of the land in the Stirling area, totalling over 13,000 hectares. A stunning 91% of this coverage is made up of species native to Scotland. However, I think it's worth mentioning that the invasive plant species continue to play a destructive role in our wooded areas. Unfortunately, 2.5% of Stirling's native woodland shrub and field layers is taken up by invasive species, with the main threat being the rhododendron. The nature of these invasive species makes it a real problem to stop them spreading. And this presents an ongoing challenge for all of the organisations involved in preserving and maintaining our magnificent woodlands. It's particularly important when it comes to protecting our ancient woodlands. They are delicately balanced, and preserving these areas is a must for future generations. Presiding Officer, I want to use the remaining part of my time to raise an issue that I'm passionate about and which I believe is important to the future of our rural areas, with forests like the rural Stirling area, and that is cycling routes. I've seen for myself how the impact of cycling route can have on visitor numbers to rural areas. And Stirling already benefits hugely from the Sustrans network. The Duke's Weekender event in Aberfoyle brings many hundreds of people to the area, a real boost to the local economy and a significant event in promoting healthy and active lifestyle. In my view, more could still be done to increase the scope for clean, green, healthy, active visits to some of our forestry areas. The benefits of bringing people into these areas in a well-managed way to engage in this type of activity are wide-ranging, not just for the economy and improving public health, but also in promoting the spectacular natural heritage that many of us can sometimes take for granted. Presiding Officer, Sir Walter Scott wrote of Loch Katrine area, so wondrous wild, the whole might seem the scenery of a fairy dream. Throughout our history, these parts have dazzled visitors. Organisations like Forestry and Land Scotland have been crucial in maintaining its natural beauty and its sustainability. Let's not take it for granted. Let's get out, let's enjoy it. Let's share it with the rest of the world for the next 100 years at least. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Gail Ross. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been very interesting learning how Scotland's forestry has changed in the last century, not least in relation to my friend and colleague John Finney's forestry horse, who I understand is called Jock, or was called Jock, rather. So the Act was introduced post-World War I, and the impact it had over the following decade is quite incredible, with a total of 192,000 acres planted by the Commission or privately via Commission grants. This was about 770 hectares per year, not bad for a newly formed Forestry Commission and in post-war circumstances. But unfortunately, the figure is actually better than the Scottish Government's average since its planting targets were introduced in 2010. This century, we should take inspiration from the history of our forests, and I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement today about the commemorative planting. We now face a different kind of challenge, the climate emergency and the ecological crisis, and we should take motivation from the past but progress with the advantage of more robust science, technology and expertise, and the Cabinet Secretary has recognised this today. Forestry is one of our natural allies against climate change, offsetting 23.6% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and its sequestration potential must be carefully fostered while also managing alongside this other priorities such as flooding, drainage, biodiversity and of course the rural economy. I was delighted that the Climate Change Act saw this Parliament agree my amendment to include policies and proposals relating to agroforestry in the Climate Change Plan. And I strongly believe this is a sustainable form for adaptation, which will deliver wide-ranging benefits both for farmers and the public good. Better for animal welfare, condition of soils and watercourses now and for future generations, biodiversity corridors and networks, and cost savings and income generation. Furthermore, work by Vivid Economics, commissioned by WWF, states that agroforestry could reduce required planting rates by about 2,000 to 3,000 hectares per year. Community woodlands also deserve a stronger level of support from government, given the benefits they show across many portfolios, with both people and woodlands flourishing when we care for each other. People come to woodland programmes to better their physical health through cycling, as we've heard, and mental well-being and education, work experience, conservation, and indeed for a very love of our woodlands. In my own region of South Scotland, we are fortunate to have the Borders Forest Trust. The Trust now owns 3 areas of the southern uplands, thought of as the wild heart of southern Scotland, and are working with communities to achieve healthy natural ecosystems that have not been seen on this landscape scale in the south of Scotland for centuries. Scottish Wildlife Trust describe ancient woodlands as vitally important, irreplaceable reservoirs from which wildlife can begin to spread into newly restored habitat, thereby helping Scotland's ecosystems to recover from centuries of degradation. And as with other parts of the country, the borders struggle with the protection, enhancement and expansion of ancient woodlands. These special native woodlands provide high biodiversity value, but sadly represent only 0.26% of the total land area of Scottish borders, below the national average even of less than 2%. Can the Cabinet Secretary say today what targeted support can be offered to provide ancient woodland coverage better in the borders and across Scotland? More broadly, Scotland, as featured in our amendment, will not make its 2020 international biodiversity targets. And can the Cabinet Secretary explain when there will be impetus put behind the post-2020 Biodiversity Fund, Action Fund, including the contribution of our forestry and woodlands can make, so we can effectively work together? To conclude, nature is the basis of our socio-economic system. There is no economic stability without ecological stability, and diverse forestry expansion should be thought of as a solution. We do not have another century to get this right. We need immediate, accelerated and evidence-based action now to deliver a rich tapestry of native woodlands and wild places, cared for by local communities and landowners, and working with us all to take on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Gail Ross to be followed by Jamie Green. Mr Green is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is well known that here in Scotland we love our trees. In fact, once upon a time we loved them so much that we were planting them everywhere, even on deep peat. Well, actually, we know that the plantations, such as those on the Forestry flows, were actually given to the rich and famous as tax breaks by the then government in London. Trees were being planted, they just were not being planted in the right places. But we've learnt our lesson, and many of these trees are now being felled and the watercourse is blocked so that much needed water can return to the bog. Andy Whiteman, in his blog Land Matters, told of the speech given by Nigel Lawson that put this tax gravy train at an end. He said, "But the present system cannot be justified. It enables top-rate taxpayers in particular to shelter other income from tax by setting it against expenditure on forestry, while the proceeds from any eventual sale are almost tax-free. The time has come to bring it to an end." The Forestry Commission, which is now Forestry and Land Scotland, after functions were devolved to the Scottish Government this year, was set up after the First World War. In 1919, the need to expand the depleted forest estate was apparent, and the Forestry Commission acquired large expanses of agricultural land to plant trees. Approximately 4,700 kilometres square of Scotland's forests and woodland are publicly owned by the Scottish Government via Forestry and Land Scotland and makes up the National Forest Estate. Forestry contributes almost £1 billion to the Scottish economy, and the industry employs over 25,000 people. And although planting hasn't hit the targets aimed for in years gone by, last year they did, and 22 million trees were planted in Scotland, bringing our woodland coverage to nearly 19%. Good compared to the rest of the UK, still a way to go if you look at our European neighbours. Presiding Officer, this is a far cry from the early 1980s, when controversial forestry decisions, such as the Earl of Seafield felling part of the ancient Abernethy Forest in 1984, took place with the agreement of the Forestry Commission. As we know, tree felling can be an emotional experience, but tree planting has not been without its controversy either. The 1985 document by the Natural Environment Research Council, Trees and Wildlife in the Scottish Uplands, says in its preface by David Jenkins, "The concern of foresters to integrate their management policy with the requirement of the rural community is obvious. The concern is about integrating the need for timber with maintaining the richness of the Scottish countryside, of which forests are very much a part." And that balance between agricultural land and forestry is something that we're getting better at. Farmers and landowners are planting more trees, and that needs to keep happening if we are to keep hitting our planting targets. But, Presiding Officer, there is always hope of finding trees that we didn't know were there, as reported in the New Scientist in 1996. The discovery of 27,000 hectares of native woodland in the Highlands has increased the size of Scotland's native forests by around 35%. Well, who knows where those trees were hiding, but that is good news indeed. And, Presiding Officer, the success of our woodland and forest is in no small part down to the people that work in the sector, as the motion rightly mentions. And I would like to hear from anybody in my constituency who knows of any lumberjills that are working in the sector. When the Rural Committee were taking evidence on the Forestry and Land Management Scotland Bill, there was a strongly held view that there were such valuable skills in this sector they absolutely couldn't be lost. And Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing told the committee at the time, "We value the expertise of the staff very highly." In this year, when we celebrate the 100th anniversary, we should appreciate the people that have worked and contributed to our wonderful forests and woodland all over Scotland. Today, we thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Ross. And I call Jamie Green. Then we move to closing speeches. Mr Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. Those are the beautiful opening words of Joyce Kilmer's famous, imaginatively named poem, Trees. Joyce was actually a man, but that's a whole other story, not for today's debate. Alfred Joyce died in the First World War. We've talked a lot about the effect of trees in war today. We've talked about the lumberjills and the great work that women did during those wars. We've talked about the great importance of trees, and therefore it is quite fitting in this 100-year anniversary since the Forestry Act that we look at the importance of our forestry estate and how we manage it. I'm very proud to sit on the Rural Economy Committee, which has been heavily involved in much of the change in legislation that's taken place over the last few years since I joined this Parliament. I was very privileged indeed to work on the Forestry Bill. It was a fascinating journey and indeed a learning curve, I think, for many of us. One committee visit which sticks in my mind the most perhaps is one, I believe it was on a visit to Mull, where we saw firsthand the work that takes place in the felling and management of trees and logs. And of course, it provided an excellent opportunity for a photo opportunity of a hard hat, a fluorescent jacket standing in front of a mountain of logs that had recently been felled. But also, I was quite struck by the experience itself and meeting the staff who are working on this. The economic and employment opportunities that our forestry provides is impressive. £285 million of GVA every single year to the Scottish economy, and it supports 30,000 jobs end to end. And that strikes me perhaps as something that we should think about. I was told on that visit that they were actually struggling to find drivers and operators for the machinery to do the felling itself. These are impressive pieces of kit. Anyone that's seen this in action, and if you haven't, please look online at some of these videos and how speedy, efficient and impressive these machines are. They'll know that technology is at the heart of managing today's forestry. Some of these machines, the operators of them are being trained, they're being taken from cities. These are forklift truck drivers from factories. And the idea that you could leave an inner city factory with no windows where you're perhaps moving pallets and go into the great countryside and work and performing this vital function of managing forestry really struck a chord with me. Are we doing enough as a Parliament to promote forestry as a viable career? Are we doing enough to give people the right skills they need to manage these multi-million-pound machines? So we can talk today a lot about planting and who owns what and who's planted what and targets and so on. But I would like to put a positive spin in the few minutes that I have here that we should be promoting the management of forestry, the tourism and hospitality opportunities that it affords us out there. Are we going into schools? Are we going into colleges? Are we doing enough as advocates for the forestry, not just as somewhere to admire on our recess, but equally as a genuine opportunity for employment? Now, we know the environmental positives of managing trees. We know that the vital role they play in flood prevention, sheltering wildlife, in carbon capturing, and we know all of this. We talk a lot about climate change, but equally, are we looking at our forestry through the right eyes? There's a lot to be positive, but we cannot be complacent. And the recent legislative changes on how we manage forestry and land in Scotland is something that we, as a Parliament, will need to monitor closely in the coming years. I'll close with Kilmer's words once more. Presiding Officer, poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree.
A man of poetry, Mr Green. We learn something every day. Colin Collins-Smith, please, to close for Labour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate has been an opportunity not just to celebrate the contribution of forestry over the last 100 years, but also to look ahead to how we build on the achievements of the past century. Scotland's ambitious planting targets are set to continue to transform a sector that has expanded so much in that time. This growth has delivered social, economic and environmental benefits for our communities. But in building on these achievements, we do need to learn some of the lessons of the past by, for example, avoiding inappropriate mass-scale planting, not planting on land with important environmental values such as biodiverse habitats or peatlands, which also capture greenhouse gases, and safeguarding against any potential harm to other land-based sectors such as tenant farming. With agricultural and wider rural support set to change, whether we're in or out of the EU, we need to design a system that better supports integration and cohesion between agriculture and forestry and encourages mixed land use. And while forestry will undoubtedly play a crucial role in helping Scotland achieve net zero emissions, we should be clear that increased forestry planting alone is not a panacea or an alternative to meaningful action to reduce emissions. Where forestry is used as part of a carbon offsetting scheme, it cannot be simply used to take the edge off harmful emissions or to justify inaction. It's also important to ensure that a focus on growing does not result in neglect of existing woodlands. Native semi-natural woodlands are incredibly valuable, providing some of Scotland's most biodiverse habitats. But due to decades of neglect, which my colleague Claudia Beamish highlighted in her speech, it still only makes up less than 2% of Scotland's land area. As well as planting new forests, we must protect and restore Scotland's ancient woodlands and the unique benefits they provide. And we must build on not only the economic and environmental value of our forests, but the social benefits of our land as destinations for leisure and exercise. One key way that's been highlighted during this debate is to support the development of more national parks in Scotland, particularly in areas with forested land, such as Galloway Forest Park. National parks help to develop many of the benefits that forestry provides across the board, with clear advantages for communities, local economies and our environment. Scotland has some of the most beautiful scenery and natural landscapes in the world, yet we have just 2 national parks. What a missed opportunity. The internationally recognised national park designation attracts tourists, creates jobs and growth in rural areas. It also helps to ensure that the forests in the park are well maintained, preserved and enhanced, and really do enhance Scotland's natural capital and biodiversity. Just one of the reasons we should be expanding the number of those parks, which is what our communities are calling for. Now, in his contribution, Mike Rumbles doesn't seem to understand that the campaign for new national parks in Scotland is a bottom-up campaign. But we do need, and he fails to grasp this, legislation from this Parliament to support those local campaigns and take them forward. The only top-down approach appears to be the one where Mr Rumbles is under the thumb of the Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, there are few sectors that can provide as wide range of benefits as forestry do for our communities. We've seen impressive growth in the forestry sector since the Forestry Commission was established 100 years ago. But as it continues to grow, we need to properly balance the economic and social and environmental benefits for the support and benefit of our local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Edward Mountain to close the Conservatives. Mr Mountain, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to refer members to my declaration of interest. Presiding Officer, the strain of World War I took its toll on our country. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, and our country's resources were indeed exhausted. Timber, as we've heard, was vital for the war effort, and we had no choice to deplete our forests to an all-time low. Indeed, that continued in World War II. Indeed, many old beech trees that are now still growing are earmarked for the construction of, were earmarked for the construction of 303 rifles in World War II, and still bear the crow's foot from the War Office when they were requisitioned. Over 100 years after the First World War, work continues to encourage our forests across Scotland and the United Kingdom. In the last year, we, the Scottish Conservatives, were delighted to support the full devolution of forestry to Scotland. More powers mean more responsibility on the Scottish Government to maintain the National Forest and meet their tree planting targets. And let me be clear, I'm very pleased that the Scottish Government has exceeded the tree planting target for 2018. But sadly, I have to point out that one good year doesn't undo 10 years of missed targets. Prior to 2018, the Scottish Government missed their planting targets. That, over 10 years, means that we have lost the opportunity to plant 30,000 hectares of forestry. The result is that in 2035, as we've heard by many of the industry experts, that our timber production will fall way behind what is required. The impact of this decade of failure is there for all to see. Scotland has the biggest area of forestry in the UK, but we are nowhere near, as we've heard, having as much forestry as compared to other European countries. And that means that Scotland and the UK as a whole must rely on importing timber. And this must change. So I'm pleased the target is rising, and I will continue to encourage the government to make sure this happens. But I also believe that as part of achieving this target, It is wrong for the government still to consider and selling off our forests and the National Forest Estate. In the last 20 years, as I've said before in this chamber as presiding officer, the Scottish Government has disposed of more land than it has acquired, and I believe that needs to stop. The forest estate is a real national asset, and it should not be sold to fund rising costs. If it continues, I believe there's a real possibility that Scotland will have no forests in national ownership. Now, I'd like to point out some of the things that we've heard this afternoon that I think are very important. I think the points made by Colin Smith on national parks helping to improve the environment and encourage native woodlands is important. But we also need commercial forestry, as he pointed out. Peter Chapman reminded us that since the Middle Ages, forestry had been declining, and that needs reversing. And John Finney talked about his experience of working with forestry horses, something I didn't know that you did, unless I've misunderstood that. He also talked about how the land was used. I actually think, well, how the land was owned, where I think it's more important to talk about how it's used. Mike Rumbles also pointed out that we're behind Europe, and I agree, and I've explained why we're behind Europe. And Stuart Stevenson reminded us that when he was a minister with responsibility for trees, he saw them as visual poetry. I'll maybe just leave that one there. Now, Finlay Carson mentioned the importance of national parks, and I commend him and his predecessor for all the works they've done on that and the works on forestry in their area. And Bruce Crawford mentioned that forests are our heritage and perhaps our saviour, but he also said that we need to control the invasive non-native species that sometimes creep into our forests. And I believe that's entirely right. Rhododendrons are stretching out and in some cases killing our forestry. Claudia Beamish also mentioned that she saw trees as a way of addressing climate change. You are so right. And Gail Ross spoke eloquently about planting trees in inappropriate areas, which was so wrong. Again, you are so right. And Jamie Green talked about the importance of forestry management and mountains of logs. Now, of course, I would approve of that. Presiding officer, the world may have moved on since the Forestry Act in 1919, but the challenge to restore forests and woodlands across Scotland must go on. We need more forests to grow our sustainable timber industry. We need more forests as a place for recreation and leisure. And most of all, we need more forests to combat the threat of climate change. Our need to grow the National Forest Estate has never been bigger, and the pressure on this Scottish Government to deliver that has never been greater either. The Scottish Government has set itself ambitious targets, and we need to meet them. We cannot afford, in Scotland, to allow them to fail. Presiding officer, these benches will be supporting the Government's motion and the Labour's amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I call on Fergus Ewing to close the Government Cabinet Secretary till 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate was intended to provide an opportunity to members from across all parties in the House to pay tribute to those who had the foresight 100 years ago to establish the Forestry Commission, and also all of those who contributed to the success of the Forestry Commission over the intervening century. I'm very pleased that many members, starting off with Mr Chapman and Mr Smith, accepted and took that opportunity and in their remarks paid tribute to the enormous efforts. It's, I think, probably impossible for any of us to do full justice to the extraordinary endeavour, foresight and ambition at a time when the inception of a Forestry Commission was seen as a very radical thing by leading landowners, ironically, who were the proponents of that, at the time, radical act, which was resisted amongst some quarters. So the work of the Forestry Commission has proceeded apace over the 100 years, and a huge number of people paid tribute. I didn't know Mr Finney's father played a part, and that's fascinating. He did use the phrase that his father operated a horse, which is not normally what one says one does on a horse, so I'll maybe just leave that one by. But he obviously has a familial and a close family connection, as I do. My late uncle worked with the Forestry Commission after he came back from the Second World War, where he had been incarcerated in the Changi prisoner of war camp. So the work that has been done by so many individuals has played an enormous part in the tapestry and the history and the culture of Scotland. And it's fitting and right, Presiding Officer, that today we have all paid tribute to that. But the finger of time does move on, and we need to look forward, not back. And I'm grateful for those members who welcomed the fact that we've achieved our forestry target. But I also acknowledge that in the past we've fallen short. There's no point in ignoring facts that do not suit one's particular agenda. I was determined that we would move forward, we would achieve the targets, and that's what happened. But I'm by no means complacent. There are many challenges. I mean, growing trees, as many members will know from their own activities, it's not like going into a shop and purchasing confectionery. There needs to be the nursery stock. There needs to be the planting of that effectively. Contractors are in short supply. The process is very, very weather dependent. The wrong weather can make it impossible. An interruption of skills, an interruption of weather can prevent that. The availability of nursery stock is a particular challenge in this coming year, although not in the succeeding year. All of these things have to be taken into account, and there's the omnipresent threat of tree disease against which we must be constantly vigilant. But what I would like to particularly do is pay tribute to the work of all of the people who work for Scottish Forestry and Forest and Land Scotland now, who together tackle this cornucopia of challenges and have succeeded, nonetheless, in achieving our target. To answer Mr Finney's point, I think, and others who have said we need to raise our ambitions, I entirely agree. I would like to see us increase further the ambition. I agree with that. And you can be absolutely assured, as long as I'm around, and I'm sure Mr Finney and his colleagues will hope that that will be for an extraordinarily long time, that I will do exactly what they want. I'll do exactly what they want in terms of aiming to increase further those targets, and I look forward to working harmoniously, as always, with my colleagues in the Green Party there in it. And I'm pleased in that sense that we've increased the target this year from 10 to 12,000 hectares, and I have managed to persuade my good colleague and friend Eric Mackay that an additional £5 million will be found for that. And I was extremely grateful. He must be a great friend of mine, because previously he provided an additional £5 million for the Timber Transport Fund. And that was necessary in order to improve the roads, but not only the roads, water connections and some rail work too, to improve the ability of us to extract the timber, because so much of our timber is landlocked, it's entrapped because there is not the adequate transport system to extract it. It then becomes liable to wind blow, and it then becomes very difficult or impossible to extract, and it then can become valueless. So the timeless extraction of wood is another relevant factor here. I'm also, Presiding Officer, acutely aware just at the moment that the commercial sector, particularly the sawmill sector, is facing extraordinary financial pressure. There has been a downturn in the construction sector in the UK, and that has fed on to the timber sawmill sector.
Can members please keep the chatter down, please?
I engage with them regularly. I met with the industry leadership group this week, and I would just say to the House, I think you should take some time to visit and communicate with the businesses in your constituencies in order better to understand this, because I do see this as an emerging challenge. Now, I'm not going to say that all of these problems are directly Brexit related. I think some deferment of investment has certainly played a part, and the importation of diseased wood from Germany of 10 to 12 million tonnes is a factor. But I want to just underscore to all members, this is a very serious current risk to the sawmill sector, and we rely on the sawmill sector as the market for our productive species. Presiding Officer, how am I doing for time? I use so much of my time praising my friends in the Green Party that I have very little time left to devote to so many other. But how could they be more important than that, Presiding Officer? I don't know. Even Mr Harvey is there, is joining in the general merriment of the occasion, is he not? There we are. Who writes this stuff anyway? Presiding Officer, let me be serious. The debate today has provided us with an excellent opportunity. We've taken it, we've paid tribute to those who serve in Scottish Forestry and FLS, in our 5 conservancies around Scotland, in Forest and Land Management's offices around Scotland. They work on the land, they work in the fresh air, they grow the trees, they plant the trees, they grow the trees, they fell the trees, they do the work that we talk about. They do it, we talk about it. But as long as I'm around, Scotland's forestry will receive the attention it deserves as an absolutely essential driver of the economy and of our means in tackling climate change for now and for the next century to come.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act. The next items of business relate to the consideration of 3 legislative consent motions. Could I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion 19629 on the Birmingham Commonwealth Games Bill?
Moved.
Thank you. Could I ask Hamza Youssef to move motions 19628 on the Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendments Bill and 19630 on the Domestic Abuse Bill?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The questions on those will be at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 19671 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a revised business programme. Could I call on Maurice Golden in this case to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. And no member has asked to speak on this motion. Therefore, the question is that motion number 19671 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you very much. Next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 19654 on establishment of a private bill committee. Again, could I ask Maurice Golden to move this on behalf of the Bureau?
Moved.
Thank you very much. And the question on this motion will be put at decision time. So we turn to decision time. First question is that Amendment 19631.4 in the name of Colin Smith, which seeks to amend Motion 19631 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next question is that motion 19631 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended on the centenary of the 1919 Forestry Act be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And I propose to ask a single question on the 3 LCMs. Does anyone object? That's good. The question is that motions 19628, 19629 and 19630 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And our final question is that motion 19654 in the name of Graham Day on the establishment of a private bill committee be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. And that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.